The position property in CSS determines how an element is positioned in the web page document. It can assume 5 possible values: static, relative, absolute, fixed, and sticky. Let's start with static. When you create an element, its default position is static. You don't have to declare it, it is just static by default. Let's start this as static box. Let's give it some color. Static box. Our static box has a color now. So by default, this div, because we are not declaring any other positioning on it, it is static by default. There is no special positioning that is occurring here. And static does not allow twerking with properties like top, left. So if I had top property here, I say top 50%, this div is not going to move anywhere. It will stay exactly where it is because it is as a static position. So top, left, bottom has no effect on it whatsoever. It stays where it is. Static position basically means I stay exactly where the web page puts me. I don't have any special movement. I am just following the flow of the document. Wherever they keep me, that is where I stay. Now let's move on to relative. Relative is the move me around a little position. Think of relative as adding little tweaks to the element's position while still keeping it originally connected to where it is. So the element is positioned relative to its original position in the document web flow. It doesn't make sense, right? Relative basically means, let's start from where I am, but you can move me around a little. So we have our relative box here, and it has its own background. If we want it to have a position relative, we have to declare it position relative. Now we can nudge it around from where it used to be. This is its original position, right? But we can move it a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, a little bit to the top or to the bottom of its initial original position. So if I give this a top 40 pixel, it's going to come down a little bit. Look at that. It pushed it down 40%. From the top, it brought it 40% down from its normal position. If I change this to, if I give it a left 40 pixel, it's going to nudge it. It's going to nudge it a little bit to the left of its original position. Relative positioning does not remove an element from the normal document flow. The element is still where it is, but it is shifting a little bit from where it is. It can shift a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right from its original position. It is still in the document flow, but you can move it around. So if you need to nudge an element slightly, but you still need to keep it in the flow of the document, position relative is your go-to. Next is position absolute. Position absolute is basically saying, let me break free, I need to go. Absolute positioning allows an element to break out of the document flow and position itself relative to the nearest positioned ancestor. This is what it means. So we have our absolute example here. We have the container and we have the absolute box itself. So this is what happens. When you set position absolute on an element, the element no longer follows the document flow anymore. Instead, it looks for the nearest positioned parent element. That it looks for an element that is higher in rank than it is and has a positioning. So in this case, we are going to add a position to this absolute container so that our absolute box can find our absolute container as the nearest parent. So I'm going to add position relative to my absolute container here. So this box will be positioned relative to this container. This box is guided by this parent container because that's the nearest parent with a position on it. It will move relative to this parent container. It will use this parent as its own reference point. If you ask it to move to the left, it will move to the left of its parent. It will move to the right of its parent. So the parent with the relative position provides a coordinate system for the child with the absolute position. So this is the parent container. This is the child container. The child has position absolute and the parent has position relative. So now if I give this my absolute box on positioning, if I give it top 40%, it will move 40% to the top of its parent container. Look at that. It will move 40% to the top of its parent container, right? If I give it a left 30%, it will go 30% to the left of its parent container. So it is following the parent container. It is not following itself, as in position relative. It is following the parent. In the case of position relative is moving according to its own original position. Like, okay, if you give me top 30%, I'm going to move 30% down where I used to be. But with absolute, it is different. It follows the parent. So it's moving 30% from the top of its parent. But what happens if the absolute element cannot find any parent or ancestors that has a position on it? What happens if our absolute container does not have a position relative? So what happens in this case is that the absolute box will default to being positioned relative to the viewport, that is the entire browser window. So if you cannot find a parent, it thinks of the entire browser window as its parent, and it defaults relative to that. And you will see what I mean. So now you can see that our absolute box is no longer here, because it is no longer following this parent. This container is no longer its parent container. Because it could not find any parent container, it is using the entire window as its parent. So it is currently positioned 40% to the top of the window and 30% to the left. If I change it and I give it a left 0 and I give it a top 0 as well, so look at that. It's positioned to the top left corner of the window itself. And that's because it couldn't find any parent, so it had to use the window. But if I restore this back, if I give this its positioning back, if I give this parent, this container its relative position back, you will see that this will move. It will move back. It will move back. So it's standing top left corner of its parent div. It is no longer using the entire window as its parent. It is now using the nearest parent, which is our absolute container here, as its parent. Let me give this a right so that it can push to the right. So like you can see, it's using this mother div as its parent. It is positioning itself relative to this absolute container. Absolute positioning removes an element from the normal document flow. So if an element has a position absolute on it, it does not follow the normal document flow. Now for our fixed positioning simply means that the element is stick to the viewport. It is always in the same spot. It is fixed. So when you set position fixed, the element detaches itself from the floor of the document and sticks to the viewport, that is the screen. And it stays there no matter how much you scroll. Unlike absolute, fixed does not care about any parent. It is always relative to the entire viewport. It doesn't care if it has a parent that has a position. It doesn't give a damn. It deals with the viewport directly. Top 0. So I want it to stay at the top of the screen. I can add top 0 to it and then write 0. Look at that. So my element, my fixed box, is fixed at the top right corner of my viewport. It's not moving anywhere. So regardless of how much I scroll my page, this particular element will be stuck here. It's fixed. If I want it to stay right in the middle of my page, I can give it a left 50%, top 50%. I give it a fixed width and height. It's going to come to the middle of my page, but it is not exactly in the middle. It is its tip here that is at the middle of the page. I need its own midpoint to also be at the middle of the page. That means we have to transform it. So if we transform it, it's going to stick to the middle of the page. So regardless of wherever we go, our fixed element is in the middle of the page. Let's take it back to the top corner of the screen. So it's back at the top now. Last but not the least is position sticky. I added some test content here so that we can be able to see how this positioning works well. So it's like an hybrid, right? Position sticky makes the element act like relative first initially. But when you scroll past a certain defined point, in my case, I am defining top 10%. So when the user scrolls to that point, top 10%, then the element moves from behaving like a relative element to now behaving like a fixed element. So it's like an hybrid between relative and fixed. The element acts like relative until you scroll to a specific point that you probably defined. And then it sticks once you get to that point. It sticks, then it becomes fixed. Sticky elements only work within their parent container boundaries, and that's why I make sure that mine doesn't have any parents here, because if it has a parent, it's going to work within its parent. So I want this div to have the entire viewport as its parent. If I declare a mother div here for it, it would move and operate within the boundaries of that parent. So let's see how it behaves, right? We're scrolling, everything looks normal. Our relative is relativing, our fix is fixing, it's not going anywhere. Now we get to, so let's see how it behaves. We have our everything going on here. We have our static, sitting static. We have our fix that is fixed to a part of the screen and is not leaving there regardless of how much you scroll. And we have our relative that is relative to its original position. We have our absolute that follows its parent. And then we have our sticky. So you can see what happens. Our sticky is in its normal position until I scroll to the point of top 10% and then it stops. Can you see that it stops? It doesn't go anywhere. It becomes fixed once it gets to that top 10%. On a normal day, it is normal. I'm here, it is normal, it is sitting in its correct position here. But once it gets to top 10%, it becomes fixed. See the different behaviors of these different positions. Let's go over their summary very quickly. Static is the default position, no changes. It's saying, I'm just here, I'm following the flow, I'm staying where I'm supposed to stay. And it is used for normal flow elements. Relative moves relatives to its normal spot. I'm where you want me to stay, but you can move me around a little. So what's the use case? If you need to nudge your element slightly, then you should use relative. Absolute moves relative to its nearest position parent. And if we cannot find any position parent, it uses the viewport as its position parent. So basically, absolute is saying, find my boss, that is my nearest position parent, or if there isn't, I will use the document and move me there. So I'm following my boss. And its use case, it can be used for moodles, tooltips, drop downs. And then we have fixed. Fixed sticks to the viewport and it ignores every scrolling. So he's saying, I am stuck to the screen. No matter what you do, I'm going to be staying where I am. It can be used for sticky navigation, button action buttons, and all. Last but not the least, sticky is like an hybrid. It acts like a relative and then sticks when scrolling. So he's saying, the sticky element is saying, I am flexible until I need to hold my ground. So I am flexible until I reach this exact position. When I get to this exact position, then I am fixed. It can be used for sticky headers or call to action banners. And that's about that for today on CSS positioning. If you found this helpful, please don't forget to like, don't forget to comment, don't forget to subscribe, turn on your notification for more tech and coding content. If you have any questions or addition, drop it in the comment section. Until next time.